Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 127, The French Honour and the Failure of Percy. In the winter of 1404, as alliances were being formed and all the paperwork was signed, a move was being made to protect the pretender to the throne of England. Constance Despencer, wife of the former Earl of Gloucester. The Earl had been killed in 1400 during the Epiphany Revolt in Bristol. She was trying to ensure that the heir apparent, or at least the closest to the line of descent, was safe, and was trying to get them from Windsor to northwest Wales, and in what she saw as the protection of Glyndŵr. The Lady Despencer hated King Henry for the execution of her husband after the failure of the revolt, and had hoped to use public agitation over the high taxes that were being borne to fight in so many different wars, and basically use her protection of these children as a weapon against the throne and a way to put them on the throne as the new king. The first steps in that was to secretly abscond with Edmund and Roger Mortimer to get them away from Windsor Castle and the imprisonment forced upon them by King Henry. King was no fool. He knew he needed to protect his lineage, and the only way to do that was to keep hold of the Mortimers, who were the direct descendants of Edward III and were actually, and as we'd mentioned before, closer to a line of the throne than Henry himself. But, of course, the former Bolingbroke was a little bit more direct with his swords and was able to win the day when Edmund was just a baby. The fact is, Henry would not kill these young claimants to the throne. He didn't want to be looked at as a child murderer, but neither would he allow them to become the focal point of English rebels, or at least that's the idea when you imprison them in a castle which is under your protection. Constance, of course, had other ideas, and moved against Henry to try and ferry the young Edmund to Glyndŵr. Unfortunately for Despencer and her followers, and likely Glyndŵr, the attempt failed, as before the group could actually reach Wales, Despencer was captured in Cheltenham, just 30 miles away from the Welsh March border. Would the English rally around a boy unable to lead, or would the fight be taken out of them due to not really having a figurehead who could lead it? These are questions that we'll never know, as Despencer was captured, as was her brother Edward, who was imprisoned for a number of years for this treason. And Edmund Mortimer remained surprisingly loyal to Henry, and especially to his son Henry V, who he had ended up becoming an advisor to in his council, and then eventually looking after his son Henry VI, on the Regency Council after Henry's death. Edmund, nonetheless, didn't really have much say in this whole matter, but it does show that the weakness of the allies to Glyndŵr in their inability to do even the small things necessary to lead this rebellion. And as I pointed out, the problem for Edmund Mortimer and his followers was that he was still a young boy. He wasn't in a position to lead a revolt. Really, what they wanted was Richard II, who was long since dead, and that's who they had wanted to put back on the throne. But with him not around, it fell to Edmund to become sort of the signal point for the rebels, and so they will consistently use his name to try and gain power. And regardless of anything else, Edmund appears to have found himself in lockstep with the crown, regardless of what his family decided or believed. In the early part of 1405, the French themselves were busy making war on Rome. They wanted to take the papal seat once and for all by putting an end to the papal schism, which had created the 2 and sometimes 3 popes that were ruling Christianity, at least Western Christianity at this point in Europe. The fact of the matter remained is that this division, which had been creating a lot of the problems during the 100 Years' War, that continued to roll on into the beginning of the 15th century. And with this, it continued to be something of an obsession of the French to try and get their man on the throne of the papacy, or at least the see, to use the more proper term. The French were pushing Italian allies in the Kingdom of Naples to agree to take on these northern Italian forces that were loyal to the Roman Pope, and hopefully by defeating them put their choice on the papal see. And within that, they were hoping to achieve something slightly a bit more obvious, in that they wanted one of the members of the French nobility, either the Orleanists or someone loyal to the crown, to be named as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which was a loose confederation of states, seen as important if somewhat diverse political alliance in Central Europe. In effect, this move would be built up around isolating England, who was one of the few supporters in Western Europe who still believed in the Roman papacy. And they were actually the only supporters left west of Denmark. The Holy Roman Empire was basically a construction of medieval idealisms about trying to recreate the Roman Empire, but do it under the Christian designation. Rolled out of Charlemagne originally, but effectively it became a German confederation, which had what would then later become the German Republic. It had the Austrians, the Swiss, some in northern Italy on occasion, and it was never really a solid political unit. There wasn't like a Holy Roman Empire army, and there was never quite the unity developed to actually, I guess, move in unison against anybody. Most of the German states themselves had their own armies, their own mercenary groups who were involved on all sides of all wars. In fact, the Swiss had developed a very strong military force that will come up again during the 100 Years' War, and again, and they are critical to a lot of the story that we see later on. But regardless, it's more a sign of political patronage, I guess, rather than actual domination. And as I said, it would then allow the French to enforce the idea that they're Benedict XIII, who's the French papal see in Avignon, to wield power in Rome and to be able to unify the Western Christians in support of the French monarchy and of the French ideas, which of course in part is to defeat their old enemy, the English. So in the early part of 1405, they spent quite a lot of time doing this. Right up until the summer of 1405, that was pretty much the French obsession. And they spent a great deal of time, effort, money, and material, and eventually men, moving troops to Naples and using basically the southern half of Italy to drive troops towards Rome in order to defeat the Roman papacy. And in fact, Innocent, who was the Pope in Rome at the time, fled Rome, and many of his own supporters were beaten up and in some cases murdered as they fled in the chaos that was going on in the city at the time. So consistently, the French were looking at this as kind of a driving force behind their political aggressions. And key to all of this was Wales. Much like Scotland, they were a key force in putting the English into check. Owen, as successful as he had been the last 4 years, was looking to be someone that they could rely upon and someone they needed in order to make the best of the situation. And with the European power struggle the way it was, having another military and another successful leader kind of in your back pocket and acting as, in a way, on your behalf, allows you to kind of take a level of maneuvering and a level of movement that the other side can't really counter because they're too busy dealing with this nation. So those are the reasons why they had supported the Welsh. Those are the reasons why they wanted to continue to do so. And ever since Glyndŵr had claimed the crown, they had been attempting to try and unite with him an alliance which would then support them against the English. But in the meantime, Glyndŵr himself could use the help, as he had now run into the problem which is seen as his first major reversal since becoming the focal point of the revolution.
I'm Daniel Norcross.
And I'm Rory Dollard.
And between us, we are England Cricket on 99.94.
We'll be every week looking at the ups, the downs, the runners, the riders, the news and the views on all things English cricket.
And believe you me, there are plenty of ups and downs. Join us, England Cricket, on 99.94.
A news story gets shared by a friend on social media, or you catch a tweet that really makes your blood boil. But how do you separate fact from fiction? That's the premise behind Disinformation, a 10-part series from Evergreen Podcasts and Emergent Risk International coming this fall. Tune into Disinformation wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, don't believe everything you read.
As we mentioned a couple of episodes ago, in the spring of 1405, King Henry renewed his assault on Wales. He now had the money, men, and importantly his son back. And with all of that, he could now finally use the current campaigning season, in other words, the spring and summer of 1405, to go after Glyndŵr to try and force a resolution. At least that was the idea. Likely in May of 1405, the king took forces from Hereford into southern Wales, while his son was taking troops into northern Wales. Again, going along the normal pathways that the king and his son did during this war, and much as had happened in the past. Once you have a Roman road, it's a lot easier to ship down there. So that's kind of what they did consistently. And so there was this focal point on these two angles. Now, the funny part of all this is they didn't seem to have enough troops to then hit in the middle as well, which typically is what Edward did. He hit all 3 points, of Wales, and in the process of that was able to put a lot of hurt onto the Welsh in a lot of different areas. But Henry just was never able, at least at this stage, to really do that. And in the end, they won a battle at Usk, which the battle itself was not a major one, and the losses on the Welsh side were not particularly high. Unfortunately for Owen and his cause, it did see a number of key casualties. Glyndŵr's men were taken by an English force led by Richard of Codnor and Sir John Gradenor. The attack would have far-reaching consequences for Owen's trusted inner circle. First of all, Griffith ap Owain, the son and heir of Glyndŵr, was captured. Tudur ap Griffith, brother of Owen, was killed. One other notable death was the priest John ap Hywel, or John Powell, known as a rabble-rousing legend by Walter Bower, a Scottish chronicler. He also was killed. Adam of Usk says 300 men were beheaded at the battle by Codnor's troops, but some academics call the idea of this into question simply because there's no other evidence other than what Adam says, and Adam was nowhere near the region at the time. Also, along with this, however, they would anger the clergy over this issue, and in killing this priest, of course, it's something that they're not supposed to be doing, and they do get in trouble for these kind of things occasionally. These incidents of bad luck, however, continued for Owen, as his secretary was then captured in May as well, and Owen's brother-in-law, John Hanmer, was also captured in June. This terrible luck would have long-term damage to the Welsh side, but if Henry felt buoyed by these achievements, it would have been short-lived, at least in June of 1405. As the English were invading, news reached the king that another rebellion had broken out in York. The Percys once again were forcing their hand and attacking Henry's right to rule. Richard Scrope, the Archbishop of York, the Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, and a number of other northern lords led this rebellion. The rebellion would fall flat on its face almost from the outset, however. Scrope and the Earl of Norfolk, Thomas Mowbray, apparently struck out before their allies were ready, and a number of men were taken captive before they were even really organized. The men were seized by Ralph Neville, the Earl of Westmoreland, who convinced them to treat with him as a way, effectively, he lied to them, and then executed them within days, drawing again the ire of the church over the execution of this clergyman. You don't just kill an archbishop in medieval Europe. Percy and his allies were so caught out that few were able to really resist the crown. Percy himself fled to Scotland, and those who did resist were defeated and summarily executed. In the end, the northern and southern allies were unable to hold up their end of the alliance with Glyndŵr, doing little more than serving as a distraction to allow the French to arrive in Wales before Henry could bring his full force to bear against Owen. In fact, we'll see that what seemingly kind of fell over so simply and so quickly was a more coordinated idea. Percy himself gets convicted in absentia in 1406, and they bring up all of the writing that he'd gone on, all the correspondence he'd had with the King of France, and how intertwined that all was with the Welsh rebellion. And the fact that it's in June of 1405, as Henry's attacking Wales, seems to show that it's a coordinated movement. And had it succeeded, who knows what would have been the result, or at least had it been slightly more successful than a complete burning house on fire, maybe they might have been able to force Henry's hand. And when we find out what goes on beyond this, it will become obvious that it looked to be that Owen was preparing something in advance of all this. However, the loss of the Percys served as another sign that the high water mark for Owen was likely the winter of 1404. As with Hotspur, the northern lords were unable to coordinate and were dispersed before they were ever able to make headway against Henry, and their general inability to achieve military success leads me to conclude that they were mostly paper tigers facing off against a much better organized and experienced military, which of course speaks highly for Owen, who was able to hold out against and achieve success against this same force from England. With Percy's defeat and the failed kidnapping of Edmund Mortimer, the machinations of the English rebels were over in this period. While this defeat came to the rebels in this period, yet seeds were sown and set in motion for what would then become the War of the Roses later on in a generation to come, because much of the sides that were divided in this discussion, in this battlefront between the various parties, are the same sides that will become involved in that chaos later. We've mentioned this somewhat before, but it's good to be reminded that we're kind of moving out of the Welsh Rebellion and we're slowly moving towards what will become the War of the Roses, as well as the end of the English control of any state in France. And all of this comes about in part because of Bolingbroke's taking over as king, creating this schism. In July and August, Owen held his second parliament, this time at his base in Harlech. Since the capture of the castle, this had acted as the seat of government in Wales. It was a location which served as a protected area. Obviously, Harlech Castle is a very difficult one to take, and it also served as being useful because it was one of the farthest away defensible points from England. However, with the invitation that was sent out to the Welsh nobility came people who were loyal to Henry and would actually inform the king on what went on in the proceedings in Wales, and would be very clear on what the results of all this would be. The spies would inform the king that Owen had help on the way, as they were expecting French troops to arrive very soon. Another aspect of this parliament was that Owen was preparing a treaty to offer to Henry. There was, of course, the matter of some sort of prisoner exchange, which I'm sure Owen desired to at the very least get some of his family members back, keeping in mind that both his son and his brother-in-law were at the protection, in quotes, of the king. The Parliament itself was made up of a sizable portion of Welsh nobility, as 4 or more persons representing each comote of Wales under Glyndwr's control attended. This included, of course, the nobility and also the clergy, but it also included people who were considered to be members of the Commons. Very similar, I guess, in a way to the English Parliament of the day, but showing that there was this sense that they needed all 3 estates to be represented. This sizable representation, of course, showed how far Owen was able to take his power as the Prince of Wales, and also, of course, showed how far he'd come in that process. Meanwhile, in France, trouble was brewing. The French expeditionary force arrived in the late summer of 1405, in fact, just about the time this parliament was ending. As these French forces arrived, a coup attempt was made by the Bourbons against the Orleanists in power. Again, this time now trying to stop the attack in Rome at the very least. Jean, Duke of Burgundy, tried to lead this revolt, only to watch some of the most powerful non-aligned families join the Orleanists, and many others remain sternly and firmly neutral. And because of that, his takeover attempt failed utterly. The French forces, of course, arrived oblivious to this, and with them came the final hope for Owen. If they could force Henry to a treaty, if they could defeat him in one battle that might actually put an end to his ability to carry out the war, then, and only then, would they be able to assert Welsh independence for good. But they had to win that battle, and they had to face Henry on a field likely of his choosing. This kind of thing is never going to be easy, and for Owen, knowing all of this didn't necessarily make his life simple. And with the defeat of his erstwhile allies in England, he knew this was his last die to be cast in this war, the last time he could have the advantage. And over the next 2 years, basically it is the last great attempt to try and hold on to power in Wales. And with that, thank you for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Welsh History Pod, or join us on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And thank you all for listening. Thank you once again to my Patreon supporters who continue to help me fund this podcast. And thank you once again, and have a great day. Talk to you later. Bye.
This has been a Distractions Media production. For more information, you can check out everything we do at distractionsmedia.com.
A news story gets shared by a friend on social media, or you catch a tweet that really makes your blood boil. But how do you separate fact from fiction? That's the premise behind Disinformation, a 10-part series from Evergreen Podcasts and Emergent Risk International coming this fall. Tune into Disinformation wherever you get your podcasts, and remember, don't believe everything you read.